The evening shift at Harborview Restaurant had started like any other Thursday night in late September. Sarah Chen wiped down the last table in her section, her feet aching from 6 hours of constant movement across the worn wooden floors. At 28 years old, she had been working as a waitress at this upscale waterfront establishment for nearly 3 years, ever since she moved to the city with dreams that now felt like they belonged to someone else entirely. The restaurant buzzed with the usual sounds of clinking glasses, murmured conversations, and the occasional burst of laughter from the bar area where regulars gathered after work. Sarah had grown accustomed to the rhythm of this place, to the way the light from the harbor reflected off the windows at sunset, to the particular preferences of the Thursday evening crowd. She knew which tables tipped well and which ones would keep her running back and forth for endless requests. She had learned to smile through exhaustion, to be invisible when needed and attentive when required. It was honest work, she told herself, even if it wasn't the life she had imagined when she was younger and full of impossible dreams. Tonight felt different somehow, though Sarah couldn't quite place why. There was an energy in the air, a subtle electricity that made her more aware of her surroundings. Perhaps it was the unusually large party that had reserved the entire back section of the restaurant, or maybe it was simply that she was more tired than usual and her senses were playing tricks on her. She glanced toward the corner where an old grand piano sat, mostly decorative now, its polished surface reflecting the ambient lighting. The restaurant owner had bought it years ago with intentions of having live music, but those plans had never materialized. Now it served mainly as an elegant piece of furniture that guests occasionally admired. Sarah's section was particularly busy tonight. She moved efficiently between tables, balancing trays with practiced ease, remembering orders without writing them down, a skill she had perfected over years of service work. At table 12, a family celebrated a graduation. At table 14, a couple sat in tense silence over their appetizers, clearly in the middle of some unspoken conflict. At table 16, a group of business people discussed contracts and projections, their voices rising and falling with the intensity of their negotiations. But it was table 18 that caught Sarah's attention most. A distinguished-looking man in his early 60s sat alone, his silver hair impeccably styled, his navy suit clearly custom-tailored. He had arrived without a reservation but had been seated immediately, which told Sarah everything she needed to know about his status. The owner himself had greeted the man warmly, calling him Mr. Castellano, and had personally ensured he was comfortable. Sarah had served enough wealthy patrons to recognize the signs of serious money, the kind that came with generations of privilege and power rather than lottery wins or sudden fame. Mr. Castellano ordered simply but expensively, choosing the most premium items on the menu with barely a glance at the prices. He was polite to Sarah, thanking her each time she refilled his water glass or brought another course, but there was a sadness in his eyes that she couldn't help but notice. It was the kind of melancholy that expensive suits and fine dining couldn't mask, the sort of deep loneliness that seemed to follow certain people regardless of their circumstances. As the evening progressed, Sarah found herself thinking about her own story, the path that had led her to this restaurant, to this city, to this life that felt both temporary and permanent at the same time. She had come here with a scholarship to the conservatory, her parents so proud that their daughter would study music in one of the country's most prestigious programs. Piano had been her world since she was 5 years old, when her grandmother first placed her small hands on the keys and showed her how to find the notes hidden within that black and white landscape. For years, music had been everything. She had practiced hours every day, sacrificing social events and typical teenage experiences for the chance to perfect her technique, to understand the language of composers who had been dead for centuries, but whose voices still spoke through carefully arranged notes. She had won competitions, performed in recitals, dreamed of concert halls and recordings, and a life dedicated entirely to the art form she loved more than anything. But dreams, Sarah had learned, were fragile things. In her second year at the conservatory, her father had a stroke that left him partially paralyzed and unable to work. Her mother, who had never finished her own education, struggled to keep the family afloat while caring for him. Sarah's younger brother was still in high school, with college expenses looming on the horizon. The scholarship covered tuition, but it didn't cover rent, food, medical bills for her father, or the guilt that ate at Sarah every time she practiced while her family struggled. She had made the decision quickly, perhaps too quickly, dropping out of the conservatory to work full-time. She told herself it was temporary, that she would save money and return to her studies eventually. She had found the job at Harborview Restaurant through a friend, and the tips were good enough to help support her family from a distance. 3 years had passed since then, 3 years of promising herself she would go back, 3 years of watching that dream fade a little more with each passing month. The dinner rush was beginning to wind down when Sarah noticed Mr. Castellano gesturing subtly for her attention. She approached his table with her professional smile firmly in place, ready to offer dessert or coffee or whatever else might be required. He looked up at her with those sad eyes and asked if the piano in the corner was functional. The question caught her off guard, and for a moment she simply stood there, tray balanced against her hip, uncertain how to respond. She had never heard anyone play it in all her time working there. The owner had mentioned once that it was tuned regularly, part of his insistence on maintaining every detail of the restaurant's ambience, even the purely decorative elements. Sarah told Mr. Castellano that she believed it worked but that she had never actually heard it played. He nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he had been thinking about, and then asked if she knew anyone who could play it. There was something in his voice, a kind of desperate hope that made Sarah's heart ache in recognition. Before she could stop herself, before the practical part of her brain could intervene with all the reasons this was a terrible idea, Sarah admitted that she could play. The words hung in the air between them, and she immediately regretted her honesty. What was she thinking? She was here to work, to serve tables and earn tips, not to draw attention to herself or to resurrect a part of her life she had carefully buried under years of routine and resignation. But Mr. Castellano's face had transformed at her words, the sadness lifting momentarily to reveal something like excitement. He asked if she would play something for him, just one piece, and said he would make it worth her while. Sarah glanced around the restaurant nervously, aware that her manager was watching from across the room with a confused expression. Playing the piano was certainly not part of her job description, and she worried about overstepping boundaries or creating some kind of scene. But there was something in Mr. Castellano's request that felt less like a demand and more like a plea, as if this mattered to him in ways she couldn't fully understand. Sarah excused herself and walked quickly to the back office where her manager, Derek, was reviewing the evening's reservations. She explained the unusual request, expecting to be told absolutely not, that she needed to focus on her tables and stop entertaining strange ideas. But Derek surprised her by shrugging and saying that if a customer like Mr. Castellano wanted live music, he could have live music. Business had been good tonight, her tables were mostly finished with their meals, and if this made an important patron happy, then why not? He did warn her to keep it brief and to get back to work immediately after. Walking toward the piano felt surreal, like moving through a dream where the normal rules of reality had been temporarily suspended. Sarah was acutely aware of eyes following her progress across the restaurant floor. Conversations had quieted as diners noticed something unusual was happening. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled out the bench and sat down, the familiar position bringing back a flood of memories and emotions she had worked hard to suppress. The keys were cool beneath her fingers as she placed her hands in position. She had not played seriously in 3 years, had not practiced or performed or done anything more than occasionally press a few keys on the electronic keyboard in her tiny apartment. She worried that her skills had deteriorated, that muscle memory would fail her, that she would embarrass herself in front of a restaurant full of strangers and one wealthy man with sad eyes who had asked for this gift. Sarah closed her eyes and took a deep breath, reaching for something inside herself that she had tried to forget. She chose Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, one of the pieces she had loved most during her conservatory days. It was beautiful and melancholic, technically challenging but deeply emotional, the kind of music that spoke directly to the heart without need for words. Her fingers found the opening notes almost automatically, and suddenly she was no longer a waitress in a restaurant but a musician doing what she was born to do. The first phrases poured out of the piano with a richness that surprised her. The instrument was indeed well-maintained, its tone warm and resonant, filling the restaurant with sound that seemed to transform the entire atmosphere. Sarah felt herself falling into the music, forgetting about her aching feet and her tables and her practical concerns. She played with her eyes closed, letting the familiar patterns guide her hands, finding that the years away had not erased her ability but had perhaps deepened it with accumulated life experience and loss. The restaurant had gone completely silent. Every conversation had stopped, every fork had been set down, every person had turned their attention to the unexpected concert unfolding in their midst. Sarah was unaware of this, lost in the world of the Nocturne, in the rising and falling phrases that Chopin had crafted to express something beyond ordinary language. Her fingers moved across the keys with increasing confidence, rediscovering the joy of creating beauty, of channeling emotion through this instrument that had once been her closest companion. As the final notes of the Nocturne faded into silence, Sarah slowly opened her eyes, returning to the present moment with a kind of reluctance. The restaurant remained completely quiet for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. Then the silence shattered into applause, genuine and enthusiastic, coming from every corner of the room. Diners had risen from their seats, some wiping tears from their eyes, others simply clapping with expressions of wonder and appreciation. Sarah felt her face flush with a mixture of embarrassment and something else, something she had not felt in years, a kind of validation that came from sharing her gift with others. Mr. Castellano was standing at his table, and Sarah was shocked to see tears streaming down his face. He was not bothering to hide his emotion, letting it show openly in a way that seemed uncharacteristic for a man of his obvious status and composure. He clapped slowly, deliberately, his eyes fixed on Sarah with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable. When the applause finally died down and people began returning to their meals and conversations, he gestured for Sarah to come to his table, his hand shaking slightly with emotion. Sarah stood from the piano bench on unsteady legs, her heart pounding in her chest. She made her way back to table 18, aware that every person in the restaurant was watching her journey across the floor. The brief performance had transformed her from invisible service worker to the center of attention, and she was not entirely sure how she felt about this sudden shift. Part of her wanted to retreat to the safety of her usual role, to hide behind the professional distance that serving tables provided. When she reached his table, Mr. Castellano took both of her hands in his, a gesture that was familiar yet appropriate, conveying deep gratitude and respect. His voice was thick with emotion as he thanked her, telling her that she had just given him something precious beyond measure. He explained that his wife had passed away 6 months earlier after a long battle with cancer, and that her favorite piece of music in the entire world had been that exact Chopin nocturne. He had not been able to listen to it since her death, the pain too raw and immediate, but hearing Sarah play it tonight had felt like a gift from the universe, a moment of connection with his departed love. Sarah felt tears prickling at her own eyes as she listened to his story. She understood loss, understood the way grief could reshape your entire world, understood the bittersweet nature of beauty that reminded you of what you had loved and lost. She squeezed his hands gently and told him she was honored to have played for him, that music had always seemed to her like a bridge between worlds, between past and present, between people separated by distance or even death. Mr. Castellano asked Sarah to sit down, requesting permission that was unusual given the dynamics of their respective positions, but that felt natural in the moment. She glanced toward Derek, who nodded his approval from across the room, clearly recognizing that something significant was happening and willing to bend the usual rules. Sarah sat across from this grieving millionaire, and they talked for nearly 20 minutes about music and loss and the unexpected ways life could surprise you. He told her about his wife, Maria, who had been a music teacher before her illness made it impossible to continue working. She had loved Chopin especially, had played that nocturne hundreds of times throughout their 40-year marriage. He described how music had been the soundtrack of their life together, how even in her final days, when she was too weak to speak much, she would ask him to play recordings of her favorite pieces. Hearing Sarah's performance had brought Maria back to him in a way he had not expected, had made him feel close to her again for the first time since her death. Sarah shared her own story in return, explaining about the conservatory and her father's stroke and the practical decisions that had led her away from music and into this restaurant. She spoke about the guilt she felt, the sense that she had abandoned her gifts and her dreams, the way she sometimes wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. Mr. Castellano listened with complete attention, nodding occasionally, his expression shifting from grief to something that looked like recognition and then determination. When she had finished speaking, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, placing it on the table between them. The card was simple but elegant, identifying him as Richard Castellano, founder and chairman of the Castellano Foundation. He explained that the foundation primarily worked in arts education, funding music programs in schools, and providing scholarships for talented students who might not otherwise have access to serious musical training. His wife had insisted on this focus, believing passionately that music education was essential, and that financial barriers should never prevent truly gifted students from pursuing their art. Richard Castellano leaned forward, his eyes intense with purpose as he made Sarah an offer that seemed too extraordinary to be real. The foundation had a fellowship program, he explained, designed specifically for talented musicians who had been forced to interrupt their education due to family circumstances or financial hardship. The fellowship provided full tuition to return to their studies, plus a living stipend generous enough that recipients would not need to work while completing their degree. It also included funds to support family members who might be depending on the recipient's income, ensuring that returning to school would not create additional hardship for those left behind. Sarah sat frozen in her chair, unable to process what she was hearing. This kind of opportunity simply did not exist in the real world, or at least not in her real world, where every decision came with impossible trade-offs and dreams were luxuries that practical people could not afford. She stammered something about not being eligible, about having left the conservatory too long ago, about not deserving this kind of generosity based on playing one piece of music in a restaurant. Her mind was racing with objections and disbelief, unable to accept that her life could change so dramatically in a single evening. But Richard was insistent, his voice firm and clear despite the emotion that still colored his words. He told her that he had spent 40 years in business and philanthropy, that he had developed very good instincts for recognizing genuine talent and passion. What he had heard in her playing was not just technical skill, though that was certainly evident, but something deeper and more rare. She had played with soul, with feeling, with the kind of emotional intelligence that could not be taught or faked. That quality, combined with her obvious dedication and the sacrifices she had made for her family, made her exactly the kind of person the fellowship was designed to support. He pulled out his phone and showed her the foundation's website, scrolling through pages that detailed the fellowship program, the application process, the success stories of previous recipients who had gone on to perform with major orchestras or teach at prestigious institutions or compose works that had been performed around the world. Sarah recognized some of the names, musicians whose careers she had followed with a mixture of admiration and envy during her time at the conservatory. The idea that she could join their ranks seemed absurd and wonderful and terrifying all at once. Richard explained that the standard application process was quite rigorous, requiring recorded auditions and letters of recommendation and detailed essays about the applicant's background and goals. However, he said with a slight smile, the foundation chairman did have some discretion in exceptional cases. He had just heard her audition, he knew her story, and he was prepared to offer her a fellowship on the spot if she would accept it. The fall semester had already started, but he could arrange for her to begin in January, giving her time to prepare and to make arrangements for her family. Sarah felt like she could not breathe. This was the kind of miracle that happened in movies or inspirational stories you read online. Not in real life, and certainly not to waitresses playing piano during their shift at a waterfront restaurant. She thought about her father, still struggling with the limitations of his stroke, still dependent on her mother's care and the money Sarah sent home each month. She thought about her brother, now in his second year of college, working 2 part-time jobs to cover his expenses. She thought about the electronic keyboard in her apartment, a poor substitute for a real piano gathering dust, because even the sight of it made her too sad to practice. But she also thought about the feeling of her hands on the piano keys tonight, the way the music had poured out of her like something that had been trapped inside for too long. She thought about the years she had spent telling herself that she had made peace with her choices, that she was fine with her life as it was, that dreams were for other people. She realized that she had been lying to herself, that the hunger for music had never gone away but had simply been pushed down so deep that she could pretend it did not exist. Richard seemed to understand her internal struggle. He told her to take time to think about it, to call her family and discuss it with them, to make sure this was truly what she wanted. He wrote his personal cell phone number on the back of his business card and urged her to contact him within the next week with her decision. He also did something that surprised Sarah even more than the fellowship offer. He asked Derek to bring him the check, and when it arrived, he paid for his meal and then added a tip of $5,000, insisting that Sarah take it regardless of her decision about the fellowship. Derek nearly dropped the check when he saw the amount. Sarah could not speak at all, simply staring at the numbers written on the credit card slip as if they were in a foreign language she had never learned to read. Richard stood to leave, putting on his coat with the careful movements of someone who was exhausted both physically and emotionally. He told Sarah that tonight had been a gift to him, that hearing her play had given him the first real peace he had felt since Maria's death. The money was nothing compared to that, he said, and he hoped she would use it to help her family while she considered his offer. The rest of Sarah's shift passed in a blur of surreal disconnection from reality. She moved through her remaining tasks automatically, clearing tables and processing payments and smiling at customers. But her mind was miles away, replaying the conversation with Richard Castellano over and over, trying to convince herself that it had actually happened. Her coworkers kept approaching her with questions and congratulations, having heard about both her performance and the extraordinary tip. But Sarah could barely form coherent responses. Derek had announced to the staff that she had received the largest single tip in the restaurant's 15-year history, and everyone wanted to know her secret. When her shift finally ended near midnight, Sarah sat in the employee break room for a long time, still wearing her uniform, staring at Richard's business card as if it might disappear if she looked away. The card felt impossibly heavy in her hand, weighted with potential and possibility and the terrifying prospect of hope. She thought about calling her mother right away, but realized it was too late on the East Coast, that her parents would be asleep, and that waking them with this news would only cause confusion and worry. Instead, Sarah drove home to her small studio apartment on the edge of the city, a tiny space that cost too much for what it offered, but was all she could afford on her income. She sat on her bed in the dark for a while, looking at the keyboard in the corner, the one piece of her former life she had allowed herself to keep. Finally, she got up and turned it on. The electronic sounds a pale imitation of the beautiful grand piano she had played earlier, but still capable of expressing what she needed to say. She played for hours that night, working through pieces she had performed during her conservatory days, feeling her fingers remember patterns and progressions she thought she had forgotten. Some passages were rough, her technique rusty from years of neglect, but the emotional core was still there, the understanding of what the music meant and how it should feel. She played Chopin and Beethoven and Debussy. She played jazz standards and contemporary pieces. She played until her hands ached and her eyes burned with exhaustion. The next morning, Sarah called her mother shortly after sunrise, knowing that her parents kept early hours and that her father had physical therapy scheduled for later in the day. Her mother answered on the second ring, her voice warm with surprise at hearing from Sarah outside their usual Sunday afternoon call. Sarah tried to explain what had happened, stumbling over the details, her words coming out in a rush of excitement and disbelief. She described the request to play piano, the performance, the conversation with Richard Castellano, the fellowship offer that seemed too good to be true. Her mother was silent for a long time after Sarah finished talking. Sarah could hear her father asking questions in the background, wanting to know what was going on, why his wife had suddenly stopped talking. Finally, her mother spoke, her voice thick with emotion. She told Sarah something that hit like a physical blow. She and Sarah's father had been carrying guilt for years, feeling responsible for derailing their daughter's dreams, knowing that Sarah had sacrificed her future to help the family through a difficult time. They had talked about it often, wondering if they should have insisted she stay in school, if they should have found another way. If they should have found another way. Her mother said that the tip money alone would be enough to cover several months of her father's medical expenses and therapy, giving them breathing room they had not had in years. But more than that, she said, the fellowship offer was an answer to prayers she had been too afraid to even voice out loud. She told Sarah that she had to accept it, that she had to go back to her music, that this was the opportunity they had all been hoping for even when it seemed impossible. Her father had taken the phone then, his speech still slightly slurred from the stroke but his meaning perfectly clear. He told Sarah he was proud of her, that he had always been proud of her, and that she should not waste another moment worrying about them when she had been given such an incredible chance. Sarah spent the weekend researching the Castellano Foundation, reading everything she could find about Richard and his late wife Maria, about the fellows who had received support over the years, about the foundation's mission and values. Everything checked out. This was legitimate, established, well-respected in the classical music community. She read interviews with previous fellows, stories that sounded similar to her own, talented musicians who had faced obstacles and been given second chances through the foundation's support. On Monday morning, Sarah called Richard's personal number, her hands shaking as she dialed. He answered on the first ring as if he had been waiting for her call. She accepted the fellowship, her voice breaking with emotion as she said the words that would change her life. Richard sounded genuinely pleased, telling her he would have his staff contact her with all the necessary details, that they would handle the logistics of her return to the conservatory, that she should not worry about anything except preparing herself musically and mentally for the intensive work ahead. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity and planning. Sarah gave notice at the restaurant, where Derek and her coworkers threw her an impromptu party on her last shift, everyone contributing to a gift card and a framed photo of the piano where she had played that fateful night. She transferred the $5,000 tip to her parents, insisting they use it for her father's care and her brother's education. The foundation sent contracts and information packets, connected her with a coordinator who helped arrange everything from housing near the conservatory to a stipend account that would cover her living expenses. Sarah returned to the conservatory in January with a mixture of excitement and trepidation that kept her awake most nights during the preceding weeks. The campus looked exactly as she remembered it. The same beautiful old buildings with their practice rooms and concert halls, the same paths where she had walked as a younger woman with different dreams and fewer scars. But she was not the same person who had left this place 3 years earlier. She had lived a different life in the interim, had learned lessons about sacrifice and responsibility and the weight of practical choices. She wondered if she could find her way back to the intensity and focus that serious musical study required. Her assigned advisor was Professor Catherine Chen, a renowned pianist who had performed with major orchestras around the world before transitioning to teaching. Professor Chen had reviewed recordings of Sarah's playing from before she left, and had also watched a video of her restaurant performance that someone had filmed and posted online without her knowledge. The video had gone viral in classical music circles, accumulating hundreds of thousands of views and comments from musicians and enthusiasts marveling at the unexpected performance in such an unusual setting. During their first meeting, Professor Chen was direct and challenging in a way that Sarah found both intimidating and refreshing. She told Sarah that talent was common at the conservatory, that everyone here had natural ability and years of training. What separated those who succeeded from those who fell short was discipline, resilience, the capacity to push through frustration and self-doubt, and the inevitable plateaus that came with advanced study. She asked Sarah point-blank if she was prepared for the work ahead, if 3 years away from intensive practice had weakened her resolve or strengthened it. Sarah thought carefully before answering. She told Professor Chen that losing music had taught her how essential it was to her sense of self, that the practical life she had lived as a waitress had been sustainable but ultimately hollow. She explained that she had a different relationship with music now than she had before, that it was no longer just about achievement or career, but about something deeper and more necessary. She was not sure if that made her a better musician, but she knew it made her more committed to the work, more willing to sacrifice and struggle because she understood what life without music actually felt like. Professor Chen smiled at this response, the first warmth Sarah had seen from her. She told Sarah that maturity and life experience could be tremendous assets for a musician, that the greatest performers were those who had something meaningful to express, not just technical facility. They would need to rebuild Sarah's technique, address the gaps created by 3 years of limited practice. But Professor Chen believed this was entirely possible if Sarah was willing to put in the hours. They discussed a training plan that would start slowly and build intensity, focusing first on fundamentals before moving to more advanced repertoire. The work was brutal in ways Sarah had not fully anticipated. Her hands, softened by years of carrying trays instead of practicing scales, developed blisters and cramping that made even simple passages painful. Her stamina was terrible, her concentration wavering after an hour when she needed to maintain focus for 4 or 5 hours of daily practice. She struggled with pieces she had once performed confidently, finding that muscle memory had faded and that she had to relearn passages note by note, measure by measure with agonizing slowness. There were days when Sarah sat in her practice room and cried from frustration, convinced she had made a terrible mistake, that she was too old and too out of shape to compete with students who had been practicing intensively without interruption. She watched her classmates, most of them younger and seemingly effortless in their playing, and felt the crushing weight of comparison and self-doubt. She thought about the restaurant job she had left behind, the steady income and simple expectations, and wondered if security and predictability might have been wiser choices than this painful pursuit of an uncertain dream. But she persisted, showing up to her practice room every day even when she did not want to, working through the technical exercises that Professor Chen assigned, slowly and methodically addressing the weaknesses in her playing. The foundation provided not just financial support, but also access to resources she had never had during her first time at the conservatory. She received regular sessions with a performance psychologist who helped her manage anxiety and develop mental strategies for practice and performance. She worked with a physical therapist who specialized in musicians, learning proper technique to avoid injury and exercises to build the specific strength and flexibility that advanced piano playing required. Gradually, incrementally, Sarah began to improve. The blisters on her hands toughened into calluses. Her stamina increased, allowing for longer practice sessions with sustained concentration. Passages that had seemed impossible began to feel manageable, then comfortable, then eventually second nature. She started to recognize moments in her playing where something clicked, where the music flowed through her with the kind of naturalness and beauty she remembered from her earlier years. These moments were brief at first, just a few measures here and there, but they became more frequent as the weeks passed. 3 months into the semester, Professor Chen assigned Sarah a major piece for her first studio recital, Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, one of the most beloved and technically demanding works in the repertoire. Sarah was terrified by the assignment, convinced she was not ready for something so ambitious. But Professor Chen insisted, telling her that fear was often a sign that you were attempting something worth doing, that growth only happened when you pushed beyond your comfortable limits. Sarah threw herself into learning the Rachmaninoff with an obsessive intensity that surprised even her. She practiced the concerto constantly, breaking it down into small sections, working on the most difficult passages in isolation before attempting to connect them into larger phrases. She listened to dozens of recordings by famous pianists, studying their interpretations, learning from their choices about tempo and dynamics and emotional shading. She worked with a coach on the orchestral reduction, learning to balance her playing with the imagined sound of the accompanying instruments. The concerto became her entire world for weeks. She dreamed about it at night, woke up with passages running through her head, found herself unconsciously moving her fingers through difficult runs while walking between classes. The music had seeped into her consciousness so completely that she sometimes could not tell where she ended and it began. This kind of total immersion was both exhausting and exhilarating, demanding everything she had, but also giving her a sense of purpose and direction that had been missing from her life for years. The night of the studio recital arrived in late April, when spring was finally beginning to show itself after a long winter. The performance was held in one of the conservatory's smaller concert halls, seating only about 200 people, but for Sarah, it might as well have been Carnegie Hall. Her parents had flown in for the event, her father still moving with difficulty but determined not to miss his daughter's return to performing. Her brother had driven up from his college, bringing several friends who wanted to support Sarah. And sitting in the third row, to Sarah's complete shock, was Richard Castellano, looking somehow older and more frail than he had that night at the restaurant, but smiling with unmistakable pride and anticipation. Sarah walked onto the stage with her heart pounding so hard she was certain the audience could hear it. The piano sat waiting, its black surface gleaming under the stage lights, both familiar and foreign after months of practice rooms and upright pianos. She sat on the bench and adjusted its height, a habitual gesture that gave her a moment to breathe and center herself. She placed her hands on the keys and felt the cool smoothness against her skin, a sensation that had become as natural to her as breathing. The opening chords of the Rachmaninoff emerged from the piano with a power that Sarah had not known she possessed. The months of practice, the rebuilt technique, the emotional depth she had gained from her experiences, all of it combined in those initial moments to create something that transcended mere performance and became genuine communication. She played with confidence and passion, navigating the technical challenges with skill while never losing sight of the music's emotional core, the yearning and romance and ultimately triumphant spirit that Rachmaninoff had poured into this composition. There were moments during the performance when Sarah felt like she was outside her own body, watching herself play, marveling at what her hands were doing, at the sounds emerging from the piano. There were other moments when she was so deep inside the music that awareness of anything else disappeared completely, leaving only the notes and the rhythm and the arc of the phrases building toward their resolution. Both states felt perfect and necessary different ways of connecting with the music and the audience. The concerto's final movement built to its dramatic conclusion, the cascading runs and powerful chords that brought the piece to its triumphant ending. Sarah struck the final chord and held it, letting it ring out into the hall, sustaining it until the natural decay brought silence. For a moment, the hall remained quiet, the audience seemingly stunned into stillness. Then the applause erupted, loud and sustained, people rising to their feet in a standing ovation that went on for several minutes. Sarah stood and bowed, overwhelmed by the response, tears streaming down her face without any attempt to hide them. She saw her parents in the audience, both crying, her father struggling to stand but managing it with her mother's help, their pride visible even from the stage. She saw Richard Castellano also on his feet, clapping with an expression that combined joy and sadness, celebration and remembrance. She understood in that moment that every person in the hall had their own relationship with the music, their own reasons for being moved, their own stories that the Rachmaninoff had touched. After the recital, there was a reception in the lobby where audience members could congratulate the performers. Sarah found herself surrounded by well-wishers, fellow students and professors and strangers who wanted to tell her how much they had enjoyed her playing. Her family embraced her with fierce pride and love, her father managing to whisper that this was one of the happiest moments of his life. Her brother admitted that he had never really understood why music mattered so much to her until tonight, but that hearing her play had made it clear. Richard Castellano waited until the crowd had thinned before approaching Sarah. He took her hands in his, just as he had that night at the restaurant, and told her that he had heard in her performance the same quality that had made Maria love music so deeply, the ability to transform notes on a page into genuine human emotion and connection. He said that Maria would have loved her playing, would have been thrilled to know that the foundation bearing her name had helped make this performance possible. He thanked Sarah for giving him this experience, for validating the work that he and Maria had done together through the foundation. The success of Sarah's recital opened doors she had not anticipated. Professor Chen submitted a recording of the performance to several prestigious summer music festivals, and Sarah received acceptances from programs that typically had waiting lists years long. Word spread through the classical music community about the waitress who had been discovered playing Chopin in a restaurant and had returned to music with such remarkable results. Publications reached out wanting to interview her. Classical music websites featured her story, and the viral video of her restaurant performance was rediscovered and shared widely with new context about her journey. Sarah completed her degree over the next year and a half, graduating with honors and with several significant performance opportunities already lined up. She had been invited to perform as a soloist with a regional orchestra, had won a competition that came with a cash prize and a recital tour, and had been offered a teaching assistantship for a graduate program at the conservatory. The path ahead was not guaranteed. She knew that the life of a classical musician was precarious and demanding, but it was the path she wanted, the life that made sense for her in ways that nothing else ever had. The Castellano Foundation held a reception for its fellows each spring, bringing together current recipients and alumni to celebrate achievements and build community. Sarah attended the event in her final semester, wearing a dress she had bought specifically for the occasion, feeling more confident and settled in herself than she had in years. She met other fellows, heard their stories of interrupted dreams and second chances, felt the powerful sense of connection that came from shared experience and mutual understanding. Richard Castellano was there, looking healthier than he had at her recital, his grief still evident but no longer quite so crushing. He had continued his philanthropic work with renewed energy, he told Sarah, finding purpose in helping others the way the foundation had helped her. He was establishing a new scholarship specifically for students who had left their music studies due to family circumstances, wanting to ensure that what happened to Sarah could happen to others. He asked if she would serve on the selection committee, helping to identify candidates who deserved support, and she accepted immediately, honored to be included in this work. Sarah kept in touch with the restaurant where her transformation had begun. She occasionally visited on her trips back to the city, always greeted warmly by Derek and the staff members who remained from her time there. The piano in the corner had become something of a shrine, with a small plaque explaining that this was where Sarah Chen had been discovered, where an unexpected performance had changed multiple lives in a single evening. Derek joked that they should charge admission for people to play it, given its historical significance, but Sarah knew he would never do anything so commercial. Her relationship with her family had deepened through her return to music. The guilt that had colored their interactions for years had dissolved, replaced by mutual respect and understanding. Her father's health had stabilized with the help of better care that the foundation's support had made possible. Her brother had graduated and was working in a field he loved, no longer struggling quite so hard financially. They talked regularly, celebrated holidays together, and attended Sarah's performances whenever distance and schedules allowed. 5 years after that night at Harborview Restaurant, Sarah was preparing for her debut at a major concert hall, a milestone performance that would feature her playing the same Rachmaninoff concerto that had marked her return to serious music. Richard Castellano had promised to attend, his health permitting, wanting to witness this next chapter in the story that had begun with his request for music on a difficult evening. Sarah had also invited everyone from the restaurant that night who could be tracked down, wanting them to know how their presence and applause had contributed to her journey. The morning of the performance, Sarah woke early and went to a practice room at the conservatory, a habit she had maintained even though she was no longer a student there. She sat at the piano and played through the Chopin Nocturne that had started everything, letting her fingers remember that first performance when she had been tired and uncertain, and desperate to believe that her life could be different. The music sounded the same and completely different, infused now with years of additional experience and growth and gratitude. Sarah thought about the random chain of events that had led to this moment, the way a single decision to play one piece of music had altered the entire trajectory of her life. She thought about Richard asking for music on the night he most needed it, about her own impulsive honesty in admitting she could play, about the courage it had taken to accept help and opportunity when they were offered. She understood now that transformation often came through unexpected doors, that the moments that changed everything rarely announced themselves in advance. The concert that evening was everything Sarah had hoped it would be and more. She played with technical mastery and emotional depth, channeling all of her experiences, her struggles and triumphs and lessons learned, into music that moved the audience profoundly. The standing ovation lasted long enough that she had to return to the stage 3 times, each time feeling overwhelmed by the generosity and enthusiasm of the response. She saw Richard in the audience, older but present, his face showing the peace of someone who had found meaning and purpose in loss, who had honored his wife's memory by helping others pursue their dreams. helping others pursue their dreams. After the performance, surrounded by congratulations and celebration, Sarah found a quiet moment to stand alone on the stage, looking out at the empty hall. She thought about the waitress she had been, tired and resigned to a life that felt small and constrained. She thought about the musician she had become, imperfect and still learning but fully alive and engaged with her art. She understood that both versions of herself were real and valid, that the journey from one to the other had required both suffering and grace, both her own determination and the generosity of others who believed in her potential. Sarah knew her story would continue to unfold in ways she could not predict or control. There would be more performances and more challenges, successes and failures, moments of doubt and moments of transcendence. But she faced this uncertain future with confidence born of experience, knowing that she had already survived the loss of her dreams and found her way back to them. Whatever came next, she would meet it with the same courage and openness that had allowed her to accept Richard Castellano's offer on that pivotal night, to rebuild her technique through months of painful practice, to walk onto stages and share her music with the world. Silent now, waiting for tomorrow's rehearsal, for the next performance, for the continuation of a musical journey that had seemed finished, but had proven to be only interrupted. Sarah turned off the stage lights and walked out of the hall, carrying with her the knowledge that dreams deferred were not necessarily dreams destroyed, that second chances were real and precious, and that sometimes the most important thing you could do was simply say yes when opportunity knocked, even when accepting meant facing your fears and risking failure. Her story had become proof that transformation was possible, that talent combined with perseverance could overcome obstacles, and that helping others pursue their passions was perhaps the most meaningful legacy anyone could leave behind.